Over 400 years ago, the English mathematician and astronomer Thomas Harriot made a calculation that feels eerily modern. Driven by concern about the number of people the Earth can support, he took the circumference of Earth and did his best to calculate the size, 50,000 square miles, and population, 5 million, of England. And then, based on birth rates and the correct assumption that lifespans would grow longer over time, he did some prognosticating about the future. Harriot concluded that in 400 years, or roughly today, quote, there would be more men than can stand on the face of the whole Earth, end quote. Like other population catastrophists to follow, his concerns were not wholly misplaced, but his predictions turned out to be wrong. When Harriot was making his calculations in 1590, which isn't even on this graph, it's sort of farther back, there were about 500 million people on the planet. Over 2 centuries later, in 1800, that number had risen to just around 1 billion. Today, the planet is host to 7.9 billion people, and demographers at the United Nations predict that by the end of this century, the global human population will swell to roughly 10.9 billion. These numbers are somewhat breathtaking when you consider that in 1950, there were still only 2.5 billion of us. In just the past 70 years, the number of people on Earth has skyrocketed. This population explosion has left scientists, environmentalists, and pretty much anyone else who sees these numbers wondering if the planet's resources can support so many people. In an age of accelerating ecological catastrophe, the question has gained new urgency. How many people is too many? Ecological limits are real. Without trees, everybody dies. Without fresh water, everybody dies. As Julia Adeni Thomas writes, quote, it would be glorious if our numbers and desires could grow forever, if all people on Earth now and in the future could live lives of increasing, heedless bounty, equitably shared. Many modern histories and theories of human society promised as much, but discovery of the Anthropocene has ruptured that hopeful human trajectory. Now, realistically, the sky is our limit. The thinning stratosphere, biosphere, pedosphere, and much else contain human possibilities, end quote. Common sense tells us that at some point there will be more humans on Earth than the planet can possibly sustain. Common sense whispers that we may have already reached, or perhaps far surpassed that point. But common sense is not science. We inherit technologies and mythologies, infrastructure and ideologies, and we can inherit ideas so deeply woven into the cultural fabric that it's hard to see them as anything other than truth. If we consider the origins of human concern about overpopulation, we begin to see larger questions about political economy, race, and geopolitical power coming into focus. People have been musing on the relationships between population growth and resources, particularly food, since as far back as Confucius and Plato. But the idea that, quote, unchecked, unquote, population growth heralds disaster is most often traced to the 18th century cleric and professor of political economy, Thomas Robert Malthus. The son of a wealthy British gentleman, Malthus was born in 1766 and graduated from Cambridge with a degree in mathematics in 1788. His adolescence was marked by the tumultuous transformations of the European Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions, as well as by the intellectual enthusiasms of his father, who was friendly with the likes of Scottish philosopher David Hume and political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Malthus also lived during the tail end of the devastating global climate event known as the Little Ice Age, when temperatures dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius. Ice and freezing temperatures gripped the Northern Hemisphere. The Little Ice Age lasted roughly from 1500 to 1850 and brought about an agricultural crisis spanning 180 years, which wreaked havoc on European harvests and which some people have argued helped bring about the end of feudalism. As temperatures finally warmed and societies reorganized, the boundless optimism of the Enlightenment took hold. The laws of nature could be known. Society could be perfected. Even in the midst of great hardship and suffering, things were looking up. Malthus also lived through the transformative accelerations of the Industrial Revolution in Britain from about 1760 to 1840, which was a time of rapid population growth across Europe, particularly among the poor. Birth rates were high, and improved public health and disease prevention, as well as better access to medicine, contributed to a plummeting death rate, which together resulted in an overall surge in population growth. Many of Malthus's contemporaries, including his father's friend Hume and the economist and political philosopher Adam Smith, were interrogating the relationships between population, wealth, and governance. Decades before Malthus published his now famous essay on population, elites across Europe and the American colonies were debating the benefits and harms to the state of a growing population. Interestingly, a lot of them thought that huge populations were necessary and good. There's a section on that I cut, but I'll just mention that. So these debates were influenced by new ideas from France, heralding the heady possibility of endlessly perfecting human society through rational thought and organization, as well as newly ascendant ideas about race and the quote unquote natural order of human hierarchies. Centuries of brutal European campaigns of colonization and empire building had given rise to the idea of separate human races with different physical and moral traits that designated some fit to be rulers and others fit to be ruled. Belief in bloodlines made some citizens more desirable than others. In 1751, when Benjamin Franklin noted how rapidly the colonies were growing each year, he mused, quote, "The number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. I could wish their numbers were increased. And while we are at it, as I may call it, scouring our planet and clearing America of woods, and so making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light to the eyes of inhabitants in Mars or Venus, why should we, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America when we have so fair an opportunity, by excluding all blacks and tawnies, of increasing the lovely white and red? But perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind." End quote. The biological mechanisms of bloodline lineages remained murky, but by the 1800s, it would be widely accepted that physical and moral traits could be passed from generation to generation. While the contemporary science of genetics has demonstrated that race is not a biological category, in the 1800s, heredity became destiny and history became biology. Franklin could not have known, as he wrote of clearing America of woods and the lovely white and red, that during the colonization of the Americas in the 1600s, so many indigenous people were killed by colonizers that a massive swath of native agricultural land was reclaimed by fast-growing trees and vegetation, pulling so much carbon from the atmosphere that it cooled the planet and helped trigger the little ice age through which Franklin was then living. As a young man, Malthus read Franklin's observations of the rapid growth of population in the American colonies, as well as his observations of that births in his American parish far outnumbered deaths, which led Malthus to believe that such human population growth could not be sustainable over time. For him, the lofty Enlightenment ideals of unending human progress were ringing hollow. One evening, as he was sitting by the fireside with his father, they got into an argument over an essay by the English novelist and utopian William Godwin, specifically Godwin's view that, quote, the extensive diffusion of liberty and happiness, end quote, among people was possible. The progressive elder Malthus agreed. The younger did not. Spurred by this argument, he eventually used a combination of rigorous empirical observations and flawed speculations to craft his famously pessimistic view of humanity's future. In an essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on the speculations of Mr. Godwin, Monsieur Condorcet, and other writers, first published anonymously in 1798, Malthus observed that when food production increased, the standard of living temporarily went up, which led to population growth and to the standard of living dropping again. In other words, humans tend to use abundant resources to create more humans rather than to improve standards of living. Using some quasi-scientific math as illustration, he argued that human populations grow at an exponential rate, 1, 2, 4, 8, while food resources grow at a slower, more linear rate, 1, 2, 3, 4. So population will always naturally grow faster than the ability to produce food. A population would always grow until there wasn't enough food to support everyone, and misery and famine would inevitably follow. Only the strong would survive. To be clear, Malthus was not sounding an alarm about the threat of overpopulation in the future. He was describing what he saw as the natural state of things now and forever after. According to his logic, A human population would always be close to the limit of consuming all available food resources, or moving slightly towards a higher new limit when the bar was briefly raised by improved methods of food production, which meant that most people will always be living in poverty. Most people will naturally be pushed to the precipice of starvation. As Malthus warned, quote, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man, that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race," end quote. In the second edition of his essay, he clarified, quote, "Poverty and not absolute famine is the specific effect of the principle of population," end quote. This is the sometimes overlooked core of Malthusian pessimism. Not that the earth has ecological limits that doom us to future disaster, but that poverty is natural and inevitable. If Malthus's calculations struck some contemporary readers as cold, his policy proposals sounded downright cruel. Of particular interest in debates over population and governance at the time was the issue of state aid to impoverished people, and Malthus used his theory to argue for the gradual abolition of state-supported food aid provided via the British Poor Laws. These laws were essentially social programs designed to help feed and house the growing population of British citizens living in poverty. As Malthus saw it, British authorities who extended aid to the poor only made the problem worse, encouraging more babies to be born into conditions made tolerable in the short term, but which could only lead to greater misery, more people facing starvation and death over time. Quote, "To remedy the frequent distresses of the common people," he wrote, "the poor laws of England have been instituted, but it is feared that though they may have alleviated a little the intensity of individual misfortune, they have spread the general evil over a much larger surface," end quote. State aid to the poor, he argued, had the opposite of its intended effect. By prolonging the inevitable, it created the conditions for more human suffering. You need to be cruel to be kind. This remarkably bleak argument was not just about the poor laws, but about the inherent futility of any attempt to improve people's lives through social change. Because population growth will always outrun the pace of food production, all hopes for increasing human happiness are in vain. Quote, "No improved form of government," he wrote, "no plans of emigration, no benevolent institutions, and no degree of direction of national industry can prevent the continued action of a great check to population in some form or another. It follows that we must submit to it as an inevitable law of nature," end quote. Despite the neat equations and careful observations, his essay was not a work of science, but a speculative rebuttal to progressive thinkers like William Godwin and the millions of people then organizing for progressive social change across Europe. It was, as Ian Angus writes, quote, "a political polemic against social improvement and an egalitarian society," end quote. Malthus's sweeping conclusions that poverty was natural and social change futile were based not only on his observations of 18th century Britain, which can hardly be said to be representative of all humanity, but also on his own deeply held religious beliefs. Malthus was a devout Christian. The same year he graduated from Cambridge with his degree in math, he took holy orders in the Church of England and was soon appointed to a rectory. A parish priest and later a respected professor of political economy, Malthus saw himself as a compassionate man, deeply committed to God and the relief of human suffering. He was also fiercely opposed to birth control. As such, he saw three main checks to human population growth: misery, which included starvation and disease; vice, which included war; and moral restraint, or abstinence. Malthus advocated for moral restraint over birth control, arguing that any man who could not financially support his children should neither marry nor procreate, lamenting, quote, "the impropriety and even the immorality of marrying without a prospect of being able to do this," end quote. At the same time, he argued that, quote, "the passion between the sexes," unquote, "is so powerful that most people are unable to resist copulating and procreating." He saw the poor in particular as fundamentally irresponsible and lacking the discipline necessary to restrict sexual urges. According to his biographer, Patricia James, he thought of the poor boys in his parish as, quote, "a different race from the lads who played cricket at Cambridge," end quote. For Malthus, it was impossible to see policy like the British Poor Laws as anything but well-intentioned human folly, running counter to the greater and ultimately irrefutable wisdom of divine law. He remained blind to the ethical bankruptcy of the notion that the rich are morally superior and should have as many children as they liked, while the poor are morally inferior and should abstain. The brilliance of his essay was that it presented an ideological argument against social change as a biological argument that social problems are caused by immutable laws of nature. Malthus's theory on population was presented not as a calculation of political economy based on observations of his own historical moment, but as a universal scientific law as immutable as gravity or the path of the Earth's slow swing around the sun. Quote, misery and fear of misery, Malthus wrote, are the necessary and inevitable results of the law of nature in the present stage of man's existence, end quote. This stage rather conveniently required a capitalist economy much like that of his own 18th century Britain. Quote, in every society that has advanced beyond the savage state, he wrote, a class of proprietors and a class of laborers must necessarily exist, end quote. In other words, he mistook history for science, reducing politics to biology. As Angus writes, quote, nearly 200 years before Margaret Thatcher declared that there is no alternative to capitalism, Malthus won the British ruling class to that very idea, end quote. In this way, observations of political economy became a teleological argument couched in the language of biological fundamentalism. When Malthus offered readers a theory of human immiseration and starvation as a mathematical function of the relationship between a population and the planet's capacity to produce food, he was describing a law of nature as ordained by God. But those who inherited this idea would come to see only science. While Malthus may have naturalized a certain vision of political economy, the transformation from history to biology was not complete until Charles Darwin got hold of his essay. In 1838, just over 2 decades before he published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, Darwin was recently returned from his 5-year voyage in the HMS Beagle and beginning to explore, quote, the transmutation of species, end quote, in his now famous notebooks. It was while reading Malthus's essay that he had his famous revelation about evolution by natural selection based on competition for limited resources. Of this moment, Darwin wrote in his autobiography, quote, in October 1838, that is 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population. And being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species, end quote. Inspired by Malthus, Darwin began to see a universal struggle for existence in which more organisms were born than could survive and reproduce, leading to fitter organisms winning out. As biologist Richard Lewontin points out, quote, Darwin's whole theory of evolution by natural selection bears an uncanny resemblance to the political economic theory of early capitalism as developed by the Scottish economists. What Darwin did was take early 19th century political economy and expand it to include all of natural economy, end quote. While Darwin's theory has proved remarkably robust, it does not, in fact, explain all of natural economy. Research by Lynn Margulis and others have shown that mutualism, a term introduced by zoologist and paleontologist Pierre-Joseph Van Beneden in 1876 to mean, quote, mutual aid among species, end quote, plays a powerful and often overlooked role in ecology and evolution. Mutualism, for example, helps explain the evolution of the eukaryotic cell, one of the foundational units of all life. And without mutualism, the terrestrial ecosystem as we know it would not exist. Roughly 80% of all plant species on land rely on mutual relationships with fungi. Nature is not, as it turns out, a capitalist. But the capitalist logic underpinning Malthus's essay on population proved a heady inheritance for generations of elites, shoring up social systems that served their interests. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Malthusian thinking came full circle with the development of social Darwinism, a baggy set of ideologies which used Darwin's theory of natural selection to justify political, social, and economic beliefs about who is quote unquote naturally fit to rule over whom. In Principles of Biology, philosopher and sociologist Herbert Spencer, not Darwin, coined the expression, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, a phrase which came to express the idea that certain people naturally come to power. Another social Darwinist, Darwin's own half-cousin, Francis Galton, helped spin history cum biology back into history by dragging the theory of natural selection into the pseudoscience of eugenics, which sought to control reproduction in order to direct the future of human evolution. The poor, immigrants, people with disabilities, and all Black and brown people were generally considered undesirable, while white, able-bodied, socially conforming Protestants were considered desirable. Galton's work paved the way for devastating projects of racist and imperialist social engineering. The apotheosis of this new quote-unquote science can be found in the rise of the Third Reich and the horrors of the Holocaust. Malthusian thinking led scientists, economists, policymakers, and indeed whole populations to embrace social Darwinism and eugenics, resulting, for example, in China's one-child policy and forced sterilization programs around the world. In Puerto Rico, between 1936 and 1968, the US government cited rising rates of poverty and unemployment as justification for the decision to sterilize nearly 35% of women of childbearing age. In the 20th century, neo-Malthusians came to see population and women's fertility in particular as a sort of master key to a host of confounding social and political problems, from communism to poverty to environmental degradation. Malthusian thinking has never really disappeared. In 2012, reports from Uzbekistan revealed the forced sterilization of women with 2 or in some cases 3 children as part of an effort to keep population down. HIV positive women have been subject to forced sterilization, particularly in countries with high HIV rates, such as Chile, Namibia, and South Africa. In Japan, sterilization is still required of trans people seeking legal recognition. Today, Malthusian ideas are subtly and not so subtly shaping how people think about the future on an increasingly hot, crowded planet. After Hurricane Katrina, one Louisiana state representative proposed paying people who receive state assistance $1,000 if they agreed to be sterilized. He cited budgetary concerns and the likelihood of more frequent hurricanes. Some scientists have recently jumped on the neo-Malthusian bandwagon, citing the threat of climate change. In November 2019, in a statement published in the journal Bioscience, more than 11,000 scientists working in fields other than climate science declared a climate emergency. Quote, "The climate crisis has arrived and is accelerated faster than most scientists expected. It is more severe than anticipated, threatening natural ecosystems and the fate of humanity," end quote. The authors outlined 6 broad steps that could be taken immediately. Their concerns followed from an earlier report from 1992 and another from 2017, known as the Second Notice, that warned of impending ecological disaster and highlighted the pressures of, quote, "unrestrained population growth," end quote. The lead author of all 3 reports, as well as a 4th published in 2021, an ecologist named William Ripple, told Business Insider that, quote, "If an individual is concerned about climate change, 3 things to consider include 1, reducing the use of fossil fuels, 2, eating mostly a plant-based diet, and 3, having fewer children," end quote. Today, it seems intuitively true that too many people on the planet is a bad thing. We know that if there are too many frogs in a pond, the ecosystem will get out of whack, and some of these frogs will die before some sort of balance can be restored. Most of us were taught some version of this in grade school, with or without a dead frog belly up under a shaking scalpel. And on one level, this story is true. When an animal population swells out of proportion with the necessary resources in its environment, it leads to what scientists call population collapse. But humans are not frogs, and the planet is not a pond. So how many people is too many? The answer Malthus gave was there are always already too many people. Because humans increase exponentially and food production increases arithmetically, most people are doomed to poverty and the threat of starvation. One of the myriad problems with this answer is that it just isn't true. Malthus based his numbers on conjecture. He offered no evidence for them, and history has since proved those numbers wrong. Human populations do not, in fact, increase exponentially, and the pace of food has not, in fact, increased arithmetically. And yet such arguments remain compelling in part because they contain a kernel of truth. There is some sort of relationship between the size of a human population and the resources it uses, but attempts to quantify this relationship have been tendentious, to say the least. Eco-fascists put the Earth's quote-unquote carrying capacity at 500 million people. Feminist icon Donna Haraway's ecotopian vision of collective, non-racist, non-coercive kinnovation puts it at 2 or 3 billion. A recent paper in Nature Sustainability put the limit at 7 billion, arguing that beyond this figure, it is hard to sustain, quote, a high quality of life, end quote. What such numbers have in common is that they are based more on the values of those doing the math than on any law of nature. Any attempt to calculate Earth's so-called carrying capacity is highly controversial because the relationship between human population and the environment relies on a complex interplay of forces, institutions, markets, technology, and patterns of consumption that is simply not well understood. In other words, it isn't just the total number of humans that matters, but the way humans organize to use available resources. Today, by most metrics, we're doing terribly. The systems we have created are utterly incapable of meeting the global population. According to the UN, 957 million people are suffering from hunger, and hundreds of thousands of people die of starvation every day. Sorry, every year. That's a crucial statistic. At the same time, the US Department of Agriculture estimates that in the US alone, between 30 and 40% of food is wasted. Calories are dumped from various points along the supply chain into landfill, along with the water, energy, and labor that was required to produce them. Malthus was concerned about limits to food production, but enough food is produced to feed 10 billion people each year, and still this food is not feeding us. While the physics of fresh water and soil degradation create ecological limits, it's not at all clear that these limits are up against. Water is distributed unevenly, and much of it is wasted, polluted, and unsustainably managed. As Mike Davis has shown, famines have historically been caused by politics, not by population growth or the Earth's ability to produce food. In late Victorian Holocausts, he details how famines, long described in neo-Malthusian terms as resulting from local overpopulation and unsustainable agricultural practices, were actually caused by the convergence of El Nino weather patterns that affect soil fertility, with the introduction of colonialism and capitalism in the global South. As colonial rule and capitalist economies took root, social inequality increased and poverty became entrenched, which contributed to the uneven distribution of food and resulted in famines. Similarly, political ecologists James Fairhead and Melissa Leach have shown that assuming population growth is a key cause of environmental degradation can blind scientists and policymakers to actual ecological and historical phenomena. In Guinea's Zayama Reserve, experts mistakenly read dense clumps of forest situated within a broader savanna landscape as deforestation caused by population growth, when actually the phenomenon they were witnessing, which they didn't figure out for decades, was reforestation by local communities. Humans are not frogs, and not all effects to biological causes. Any attempt to understand human population dynamics requires understanding that humanity is not a monolith, and that the relationships between people and our environments rely on a complex interplay of social forces operating within systems that some humans have built and the rest of us live within. It requires recognizing that for millennia, humans have organized societies in many different ways, and that the systems in place today are not necessarily intrinsic to human nature, all of which may place certain questions out of the grasp of even the brightest biologists. Asking science to quantify how many people the planet can sustain risks asking a question that science simply cannot answer. And yet today, across the political spectrum, politicians, pundits, and environmentalists still lean on naturalized ideas about population growth to explain social problems and, increasingly, environmental degradation, from toxic air and soil to the climate crisis. People continue to see these problems as biological functions of population growth, but science can't separate human biology from our technologies, economies, and social systems. When we ask how many people this planet can sustain, we have to ask, doing what, living how? At the heart of arguments about population growth and carrying capacity, you have what some people think should happen being expressed in terms of what is possible. Because these theories are numbers-driven, couched in scientific terms of nature and ecology, drenched in demographic data, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that a value system can be translated into those quantitative terms. As historian Matthew Connolly points out, Malthus was, in effect, positing an answer to the question, who shall inherit the earth? Eugenicists made this question explicit. 20th century capitalists tried their best to answer it in their favor. As far back as Plato's Republic, writes Connolly, a certain type of thinker has fantasized about a natural order in which a guardian class could be, quote, bred to rule, the unfit left to die, and everyone sold the same old myth that political inequality reflected the natural order of things, end quote. And as far back as Malthus, people have pointed to population growth as the cause of complex social problems, in part because it suggests convenient solutions in which the root of the problem is other people. But if you frame the problem differently, the equations change. As Friedrich Engels wrote in a scathing critique of Malthus's, quote, vile and infamous doctrine, this repulsive blasphemy against man and nature, end quote. He saw the, quote, liberal system of free trade and, quote, competition as, quote, the cause of misery, poverty, and crime, end quote. Different problem, different solutions. Malthus and his hydra-headed legacy leave us to wonder what a politics for our age of ecological breakdown might look like. One that takes ecological constraints seriously and, at the same time, values both non-human and human life. Ecological limits are real and we ignore them at our peril. But to those who say it's not possible for so many billions of people to live sustainably on this one small planet, I would say we haven't tried.